ご出席ありがとうございます。最初に私から、今日のアーノルド先生の簡単な紹介をさせていただきます。すでにご案内の通り、アーノルド先生は現在、シカゴ大学の准教授でいらっしゃいますけれども、この度ご著作「Blind Buddhas and Believing the Problem of Intentionality in Classical Buddhist and Cognitive Scientific Philosophy of Mind」によりまして、沼田智秀仏教書籍優秀賞受賞されました仏教伝道協会の賞でございます。で、毎年この英語で執筆された仏教学術書の中から、優秀な作品が選定されてこの賞が与えられているわけでございます。で、アーノルド先生は今回東京と京都で、記念のこの受賞記念の学術講演を行われるということで、京都では龍大で、ご講演をいただくということになったわけでございます。そうしましたらアジア仏教文化研究センターのセンター長桂翔龍先生より本日のアーノルド先生のご講義の内容についてごく簡単にご紹介をしていただいた後、アーノルド先生からテーマを読んでいただくという形で進めてまいります。よろしくお願いします。
最初は通訳しようと思ったんですけれど、アーノルドさんの講演を私2、3回聞きましたけど、大抵非常に難しい哲学者ですので、今回は比較的分かりやすいペーパーを用意してくださったんですが、もう通訳することを諦めまして、最初に、簡単なごく簡単に何が問題かというと、彼は受賞作を回してください。これ受賞作。それから最初の著作はBuddhist Brahmins and Belief というエピステモロジーのサウセーションフィロソフィーという、これも AAR、You got a prize from AAR、これもアメリカ宗教学会で賞を取られたというのをましたけど、それ以来ですね、アーノルドさんの中間理解はプトガラバーダ的じゃないかというのがそういう、批判というか、だからプトガラバーダ的に龍樹を理解してそれで仏教と言えるのかというような批判をいくつか受けたそうであります。実際今日のお話の中で、ジョナサン・ゴールドとそれからもう一人の方のですね批判のご紹介がありますけど、それに対して、今回彼は自分の龍樹もしくは中華の人たちは少なくともというか世俗のレベルですね、世俗的な存在のレベルで、プトガラパーソンとかあるいはセルフというものを認めていたんじゃないか。もちろん中間派ですから勝利のレベルでは何も存在すると何ら存在するものはないという、当然の立場なんですが、世俗的なレベルではプトガラ的なものアートマン的なものを認めていて、議論を構築したんじゃないかというのがアーノルドさんの中間解釈であります。それがで彼の問題はどうもそれは無我という仏教の教えからするとそれに反するというふうに批判されるんじゃないか、批判されてきたんじゃないかと、それに対する反論を加えようという試みだと思います。ハイデガーとかね、何人か西洋哲学の、哲学者のお話も出てまいりますので、ですが全て本日お配りしましたこのペーパーの中にそのまま多分読んでくださると思いますので、皆さんにもフォローしていただけると思います。そして、ちなみにここに出てくる、ガネイリさんの本だとかね、それから「You didn't mention Peace Street」いくつか、最近このプトガラバーダ関係の著作がこの10年ぐらいいくつか出ております。それを2冊ほど持ってきましたので、関心のある方はまたご覧いただきたいと思います。それではPlease stand.
Sure. Do I need to use the microphone, or can you hear me okay? Microphone? Okay, I prefer. So thank you for the introduction. I first came to Japan over 30 years ago as a high school student. And this is actually my first trip back here since that time. So I'm especially grateful for the chance to be back here. So I particularly appreciate Katsura Sensei at Ryukoku University for hosting me, and仏教伝道協会for supporting this trip. I'm really happy to be here. What I have in the way of a PowerPoint is just excerpts from the paper to help you read along. But I know you also have a copy of the paper in front of you, so there's really nothing in the PowerPoint that's not in the paper. Follow whichever one is easiest for you to make sense of. Before I start reading from the paper, though, I wanted to say something about the title of my talk, which I came to realize is a little bit misleading. After word of my talk was circulated, I got a bunch of emails from people curious about the radical interpretation that I had in mind. In fact, I don't have it in mind to argue for a radical interpretation. My point instead is to respond to some critics who have supposed that my interpretation is radical. So the answer to my title question, is Madhyamaka Buddhist, is going to be yes. My point is going to be to argue against some critics who have wondered whether my interpretation makes sense as Buddhist. I want to argue against them that, in fact, I can make perfectly good sense of Madhyamaka as Buddhist. So I do not embrace the characterization of my interpretation as radical, just to be clear. Okay? I will start then. Over the years, in the two books that Katsura Sensei referred to, I have advanced an interpretation of Madhyamaka that frames Nāgārjuna's arguments in terms suggested by some contemporary debates in philosophy of mind. My thought is that Nāgārjuna can be understood to reject the reductionist elaboration of Anatmavada, of the no-self doctrine, that was epitomized for him by Abhidharma philosophy, and as doing so for the reason that the Abhidharmika's own project depends for its intelligibility on the conventionally real world, which is to say that Abhidharmika explanations make sense only relative to the very level of description that they were supposed to explain. I have argued that this point is illuminated by engaging some contemporary arguments against physicalism in philosophy of mind. And these contemporary arguments are to the effect that a scientific account of the mental cannot be held to explain everything about the mental. And the reason for this is the same as Nāgārjuna's reason for rejecting any supposed ultimate reals. So just as for Nāgārjuna, it's only relative to the conventionally real world that any ultimately true description can even make sense, so too, some contemporary critics of physicalism argue that any scientific account of the mental will itself be intelligible only for minds, and minds therefore cannot finally be eliminated from any account. So Nāgārjuna's point is that a conventionally true level of description cannot be eliminated from a complete account of what there is. Indeed, I take it that Nāgārjuna's point is that there is nothing more real than the conventionally existent world. But it's important in this regard to keep in mind that it is particularly selves or persons whose reducibility is in question here. So it's not hard to understand cases where it makes sense to say that there is something more real than the conventional world. We understand that sunrise and sunset ultimately consist in facts about the Earth's rotation, or that heat ultimately consists in molecular motion. So why should the case of persons be any different? But when we're considering things like persons, and when we're asking whether persons can be reductively explained, matters become a lot trickier, because now we are asking whether it makes sense to think we could explain away the very level of description at which explanations make sense. So the point is, it is persons who seek explanations of anything, and it's persons who assent to or affirm any explanations as true. And I take it that Nāgārjuna's point is that it matters that the very perspective from which we do philosophy is therefore always implicated in the matters under investigation. This is Nāgārjuna's point on my reading in saying, as he does at Mula Madhyamaka Karika 2410, that the ultimate truth, which we have to understand in order to achieve nirvana, the ultimate truth cannot itself come into view without reliance upon ordinary usage or conventional truth. And what's distinctive of my interpretation is that the conventionally real world it most particularly means in this case the world that involves what I would call a person level of description. So the most significant fact about the conventional truth that I say Nāgārjuna thinks we cannot eliminate is that it's characterized by a person level of description. Conventional truth is the level at which we make at which we speak in terms of persons. But this is a point, I am arguing, that is consistent with what I take to be the cardinal Buddhist doctrine, namely Anattavada, selflessness. So consider what is perhaps the most basic question raised by the doctrine of Anattavada. If there are no selves, what is there? If there are no selves, if as Buddhists claim there are no selves, then what does ultimately exist? And the Abhidharmika answer to this question is that what really exists, or what ultimately exists, is causally continuous series of momentary psychic and physical events, called dharmas in the Abhidharma literature. So the Abhidharma answer is to say, there are not really any selves, but an impersonal account of causally describable psychophysical events does succeed in getting at what ultimately exists, or what is ultimately real. This way of answering the question reflects an understanding of the two truths on which ultimately real existence can be identified and can explain a conventionally real world whose manner of being is deficient in comparison. Okay, that's the Abhidharma answer to the basic Buddhist question. Nāgārjuna, I take it, rejects this view of the two truths. He argues that nothing can coherently be thought to be ultimately real, since anything proposed as ultimately real turns out to depend for its intelligibility on something else. So we can never reach the bottom. With respect then to our framing question, the question again, if as Buddhists say there are no selves, then what is there really? Nāgārjuna's point is precisely that there is nothing that being a person really or ultimately consists in. Nothing that it could look like to answer this question at all. He thus argues not against existence per se, but against a particular criterion of existence, a criterion according to which we can identify ultimately existent things. But the problem with anything thought to be ultimately existent, the problem in particular with the Abhidharmika's basic category of dharmas, is that these categories can themselves come into view only insofar as we also already have persons in view. Now, my use of the language of personhood might be thought problematic here, as this seems to bring to mind the doctrine of Pudgalavada, or personalism. And Pudgalavada, as we all learned at our mother's knees, was heretical for pretty much all Indian Buddhist schools of thought. And indeed, Pudgalavada was the target of critique by none other than Nāgārjuna's commentator, Chandrakirti. So, some critics of my interpretation have asked whether Nāgārjuna's philosophy on my interpretation thereof really makes sense as Buddhist philosophy. They're troubled by the emphasis on a person level of description here, and think, well, this sounds like a heretical doctrine that was rejected by Buddhists. These critics worry that on my reading, Nāgārjuna would be affirming precisely what Buddhists supposedly set out to challenge, namely a conventionally described world. Isn't this the same as just reintroducing selves? How could one argue, as I have said Nāgārjuna does, for the ineliminable character of a personal level of description and still be a proponent of the no-self doctrine? So, some examples of this kind of criticism. My good friend Jonathan Gold writes in an exchange that is forthcoming in Philosophy East and West, and I quote from John Gold, he writes, "If it is self-contradictory to deny that we are reasoning persons, does this mean that the Buddha mistakenly contradicted himself when he affirmed no self and taught that our actions were caused by ignorance?" To similar effect, Charles Goodman has argued that my highly controversial interpretation, those are his words, it's especially from Charles Goodman that I get the thought that some people think mine a radical interpretation. So he thinks my highly controversial interpretation is obviously at odds with the Buddhist tradition's most basic claims and scriptures. So he says, and I quote at length from Charles Goodman's review of my book, "One of the greatest intellectual achievements of the Buddhist tradition was the discovery of the idea that thought and agency are made possible by, and actually consist in, a complex array of impersonal processes. Versions of this idea appear frequently in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. Indeed, this is exactly what is meant by dependent arising in such texts as the Shalastambha Sutra. The prominent role of quotations from the Shalastambha Sutra in Shantideva's Shiksha Samuchaya is evidence that Madhyamakas did not reject this discovery, but built their view upon it. Arnold, on the other hand, does wish to deny this thought, in spite of the fact that the advent of scientific psychology has given it far more empirical support than it ever could have had in ancient India." What I want to argue against these kinds of critiques is that Madhyamaka, even on my interpretation of it, in fact makes perfectly good sense as elaborating the doctrine of Anatmavada, and makes sense to that extent as a Buddhist position. So I take it, and I know this is among the questions Katsura Sensei will have for me, but I take it that to be a Buddhist position is to be a position that elaborates the Anatmavada doctrine. I take it that that's the doctrine that in some way or another all Buddhist philosophers are concerned with making sense of. Okay? I'm going to begin, though, in a way that might not be thought very helpful, because I'm going to begin by invoking a thinker, a non-Buddhist thinker, whose project is vast and problematic enough that he might be thought unlikely to shed any light here. So consider my interpretation, I ask you to do, of Madhyamaka in terms suggested by some things that Martin Heidegger says in Being and Time about Dasein. Now, what Heidegger means by Dasein is a debated question, complicated, but it's clear that whatever else he means, Heidegger means by Dasein to refer to a distinctively human, or even the distinctively human way of being. And chief among Heidegger's contentions is that the history of Western philosophy has been systematically misled by its unexamined tendency to theorize Dasein in terms of the same metaphysical categories derived from and applied to objects. This point is clearly made by Heidegger's critique of the Cartesian cogito argument, the I think, therefore I am argument. Descartes' problem, according to Heidegger, is that he concluded from this argument that subjectivity must be some other kind of thing in the world. As Heidegger says, and I quote, "With the cogito sum, Descartes had claimed that he was putting philosophy on a new and firm footing. But what he left undetermined when he began in this radical way was the kind of being which belongs to the res cogitans, the thinking thing, or more precisely, the meaning of the being of the sum." So when Descartes says, "I think, therefore I am," what does he mean by am? What kind of being is expressed? expressed with them. And Heidegger's thought is that the kind of being Descartes attributed to subjectivity was the kind that applies to objects. So he says, Heidegger does, that Descartes takes the being of Dasein in the very same way as he takes the being of the res extensa, namely as substance. To mistake Dasein as a kind of thing for Heidegger is perhaps especially to miss the fact that persons are always projects in process, never fully given as already complete. Okay, I suggest, however counterintuitively it might seem, that this point can help make sense not only of my interpretation of Madhyamaka, but also of the sense my interpretation makes as elaborating the basic Buddhist doctrine of Anatmavada. So, consider again the basic philosophical question that I said is occasioned by an affirmation of the no-self doctrine. Namely, if there are no selves, then what is there really? Or to put the question more existentially, if I am not a self, what am I really? The Abhidharmika strand of Buddhist philosophy can be understood above all to have taken the bait of this question. So to the question, what am I really? The Abhidharmikas answered that you are really just a continuum of momentary psychophysical events. Nāgārjuna's worry on the proposed Heideggerian way of getting at my point is that the Abhidharmika answers this question at all. Because to answer the question, what am I really, is implicitly to affirm a premise shared with the self theory, with Atmavada. Whether one says you are really an Atman or that you are really a continuum of momentary events, either way, there is some kind of thing or things that it makes sense to say that being a person ultimately is. Against this, I take the Madhyamaka insight to be that there is no such thing as what we really are. The point of the Buddhist doctrine of Anatmavada is just to refuse as misguided and incoherent the question, what am I really? Indeed, the idea that this question should or can be answered is precisely the problem to be overcome by Buddhist practice. So, this Heideggerian sketch of my interpretation of Madhyamaka is inspired partly by an account of Madhyamaka recently ventured by Jonardon Ganeri. An account I'm not entirely sure I understand. I'm partly trying to make sense of Ganeri's interpretation. In his book, The Concealed Art of the Soul, Ganeri characterizes Aryadeva and Chandrakirti as having elaborated what he calls a performativist account of self, which seems to me to get at some of the same points I most want to emphasize about Madhyamaka. Ganeri introduces his interpretation with reference to the third verse of chapter 10 of Aryadeva's Chatushataka, which Ganeri translates this way. That which is self to you is not self to me. From this fixed rule, it follows that that is not self. Indeed, the construction of a sense of self arises out of the impermanent things. I'll say more in a moment about some problems with Ganeri's understanding of this verse, but here is how he elaborates its significance. With the first quarter verse, which I think can be more elegantly translated, the self which is yours is not a self for me. Aryadeva states what Ganeri characterizes as an adequacy condition on potential theories of self. Ganeri means by this that Aryadeva says that among the things the Atman theory was supposed to explain, things like agency and personal identity, among the things the Atman theory was supposed to explain is subjectivity. The Atman theorist thus wants to argue, Ganeri says, that lacking the concept of a self, I would not be able to draw the distinction between what is mine and what is yours. Indeed, Ganeri continues, our capacity to make that distinction is just what the Atman theory was supposed to explain. Ganeri then understands the remainder of Aryadeva's verse. I'll give my translation shortly, but recall that Ganeri begins by translating, from this fixed rule, it follows that that is not self. He takes the remainder of the verse to argue that Atman theories fail to meet this adequacy condition. They fail to meet the criterion that they themselves need to meet for the Atman theory to make sense. The reason for this, on Ganeri's reading, is just that Atman theories conceive selves in terms of the kinds of things that can be objects of awareness. And I quote from Ganeri, "Our concept of an object is a concept of something public, an inhabitant of a shared world, something that can equally well and simultaneously be the common focus of your attention and my attention. To reify the self, to explain our possession of a concept of self on the model of our possession of the concept of an object, is thus precisely to render one incapable of explaining why we have the concept of self in the first place." That's the end of the quote. So, I hope you can see now why I thought of Heidegger. Aryadeva's characteristically Madhyamaka critique, according to Ganeri, is rather like Heidegger's critique of Descartes. For Aryadeva, the self-theory, Atmavada, although proposed to explain subjectivity, cannot in fact make sense of subjectivity at all, and this because the doctrine amounts to the introduction of a new kind of thing in the world, a kind of object called self. This is what it means on Ganeri's reading to say that the self-theory presupposes svabhava. And since the presupposition of svabhava is, of course, the problem with all of the views Nāgārjuna targets, the problem with the Abhidharmika account of persons will be just the same as the problem with the self-theory. Whether persons essentially consist in selves, in atmans, or simply in causally continuous series of momentary events, either way, there is thought to be something more real than the ordinary persons that we're supposedly explaining. But, and here I transition to the translation of the verse, Ganeri introduces his interpretation with reference to a verse that I think he has dimly understood and poorly translated. Aryadeva's verse, in fact, makes a much simpler argument than Ganeri's reconstruction suggests, and we cannot understand what Aryadeva thinks follows from his adequacy condition on potential theories of self without better understanding the verse. As Ganeri notes, Aryadeva's second quarter verse is, owing to Sanskrit sandhi rules, ambiguous between two possible readings. Tena atma niyamanasa and tena atma aniyamanasa. So the privative prefix in the second word gets lost in the long a at the end of atma, and it could make the Sanskrit could read either way. And the latter reading, aniyamatnasa, is in fact recommended by the Tibetan translation of the Sanskrit verse. Ganeri is right, I think, to follow Chandrakirti in reading against the Tibetan, Tena Atma Niyamatnasa. But his translation of this quarter verse, and again he translates, "From this fixed rule it follows that that is not self," I think obscures the straightforward argument being made. In fact, it's clear from Chandrakirti's comment that we should understand niyamat not as meaning from a fixed rule, that's how Ganeri translates, but as an adverb roughly synonymous with svabhavata, or essentially. Here's what Chandrakirti says. "For that very self which is yours, the object of your egocentrism, is not a self for me because of its not being the object of my egocentrism and because of its not being the object of my own self-affection. Since this is so, accordingly, it is not invariably a self, and a self which does not exist invariably does not exist essentially. Hence, projection of a self whose referent is unreal should be abandoned." Following Chandrakirti, whose reading I think is clearly correct, we can translate the full half verse this way. The self which is yours is not a self for me. Accordingly, it is not invariably a self. Aryadeva's deceptively straightforward point, it then becomes clear, is just that anything that could be thought essentially to be a self would have to be so invariably. But in fact, the same thing taken as self by one subject does not show up as self for any other subjects, and vice versa. So it fails to be invariably or essentially the kind of thing it's supposed to be. So the performativist account of the language of self that Canary has attributed to these thinkers, though, is in fact more informed not so much by this verse, but by Chandrakirti's commentary on the second half of Aryadeva's verse. In Ganary's translation, recall, the second half verse says, "Indeed, the construction of a sense of self arises out of the impermanent things." I would instead translate, "So the conception of self certainly occurs with regard to impermanent things." I'll skip the reason why. But here, at any rate, is how Chandrakirti explains what follows for Aryadeva from the claim made in the first half of the verse. Here's Chandrakirti. Since, according to the foregoing reasoning, according, that is, to the first half of the verse, since there is never any existence of a self that is essentially established apart from the aggregates, the conception of self is thus the projection of an unreal object applied to impermanent things, namely the five skandhas and so forth. For, just as fire depends on fuel, in the same way a self comes into view relative to the aggregates. And insofar as it is analyzed in five ways, that is, in terms of being the same as or different from the aggregates, the self does not exist essentially. It is posited as a relative manifestation. That's the key term of art here. Thus, it is established that the conception self pertains to impermanent conditions. In this very characteristic passage, Chandrakirti plays with the important Madhyamaka term upadaya prajnapti, and it's especially Chandrakirti's many discussions of this term that best support my idea that Madhyamaka is aimed especially to recuperate a person level of description. In this commentary passage, Chandrakirti argues that the self is made known, prajnapyate, that it shows up, or as I have translated, comes into view, only relative to upadaya, the kinds of things, such as the skandhas, that Buddhists had traditionally proposed as impersonal constituents to which selves can be reduced. The various impersonal things that Abhidharmikas took as more basic than selves are collectively referred to by Nāgārjuna and Chandrakirti as upadana, which we may translate as basis or substrate. This term is the accusative correlate of the many forms of the verbal root from which it derives, namely upada, to take up or appropriate, which is the same root that gives us the word upadaya, the gerund, that gives us the gerund upadaya, which I have translated as relative to. Most basically then, Nāgārjuna and Chandrakirti make the point, in the many passages where they talk this way, that selves come into view, prajnapyate, only relative to an impersonal basis, upadana, upadaya. Another important passage where Chandrakirti talks this way is in his commentary on Mula Madhyamaka Karika, chapter 27, verse 8. And in that verse, Nāgārjuna says, "Thus, the self is not other than its appropriated basis, upadana, nor is it the same as the basis, nor does it exist without basis. Nor, however, is there any certainty that it doesn't exist." For Nāgārjuna, none of the relations between a self and its impersonal basis, or upadana, makes sense. But the surprising and unexpected conclusion he draws is to emphasize that That does not mean that the self, therefore, does not exist at all. Rather, since it is only relative to the perspectives that are persons that we could identify anything as the parts thereof, reference to selves is unavoidable if we would make sense even of abhidharmas in personal terms of analysis. Here is Chandrakirti's elaboration of the point. And I've underlined the passage, the parts of the passage involving prajñapyate and upadana. He says, how could it be that what is made known, or what comes into view, prajñapyate, relative to the aggregates, does not exist? For the son of a barren woman, insofar as there is no such thing, doesn't come into view relative to the aggregates. How, when there is a basis, does it make sense to say there is no appropriator, upadāntar? Therefore, its not being existent doesn't make sense either. Because of this, the certainty that there is no self doesn't make sense either. Chandrakirti thus says that the kinds of things that are such that they can be made known, or that can come into view, relative to other things, are essentially different from altogether non-existent things, like sons of barren women. Indeed, the kinds of things that do come into view must in fact remain in view if we are even to identify the basis, upadana, relative to which they do so. The point of the no-self doctrine, therefore, cannot be that while there are no selves, we can instead say that there is an ultimately existent basis which could be mistaken for such. This cannot be the point of the doctrine because any such basis could only be, just like the persons it was invoked to explain, itself a relative manifestation, upadaya prajñapti, a dependent coming into view. And, I am emphasizing, among the things the manifestation of an impersonal basis is relative to is the very thing that it was supposed to explain. That is, while it's true that selves do not come into view except relative to some impersonal basis, upadana, it is no less true that this basis does not come into view either except relative to the appropriator, upadāntar, in virtue of which an upadana can be identified in the first place. And the point of my interpretation is to say that this is precisely to say that the impersonal conditions of personhood do not themselves come into view except relative to a person level of description. Following Ganeri, I further suggest that Chandrakirti also means to say that the coming into view, or prajñapti, of a personal level of description is not a thing. Insofar as exists means is an object, the temporal character of anything that comes into view is just not something to which that way of being applies. I take it this is suggested by Nāgārjuna and Chandrakirti's use of the infinite verbal form upadaya, the gerund form of the same root that they're ringing the changes on. This qualifier suggests that the taking up or appropriating in virtue of which anything could be characterized as something appropriated, upadana, is always already happening. In other words, before we can get to explaining anything, we must always already be taking it somehow. Any attempt, therefore, to explain persons, and persons are the very beings that take things as requiring explanation in the first place, is always already outstripped by the very thing, the very taking, that we were trying to understand. This is what it means on my interpretation, that the ultimate truth is intelligible only relative to conventional truth. I understand, to the extent I understand it, Ganeri's performativist account of the language of self to amount to the same point. So Ganeri similarly follows Chandrakirti's framing of the issue in the passage in his comment on Chatushatakha 10.3. in terms of the relation between appropriator and appropriated. Here's what Ganeri says. The appropriation in question, and Ganeri's word appropriation renders upadana, is to be thought of as an activity of laying claim to, not the making of an assertion of ownership. Grammatical form notwithstanding, the avowal or self-ascription of a mental state, I have a pain, is not a two-place relation between me and my pain. When I say, I am in pain, I do not assert ownership of a particular painful experience. Rather, I lay claim to the experience within a stream. As I understand Ganeri's point, the point is that there can be no perspective on persons that is just given as the perspective that picks out what persons really are. One must rather always already be taking upadaya, taking things some way before it can make sense to see any explanations. So when it comes to reductively analyzing persons, what is being explained is the very perspective from which anything could so much as make sense as an explanation. And that perspective is not an already given thing, but is an event of taking. Now, given my use of person talk in the foregoing explication of Chandrakirti on Upadaya Pratnyapti, it's perhaps not surprising that the passage from Chandrakirti that I additionally brought to the discussion here concerns one of the verses from Nāgārjuna, this 27.8, that Tilman Vetter has characterized as betraying, quote, a certain closeness to the doctrine of the person, Puddhalavada, at least in the careful formulation which describes the person as neither different from nor identical with the parts. Vetter has gone so far as to venture that, and I quote, accepting a person on a preliminary level of truth as having the same reality as the constituents of a person seems to be the most individual characteristic we know of Nāgārjuna, who probably grew up, Vetter further says, in some kind of Puddhalavada milieu. So I quite agree with Vetter in saying that one of the most characteristic of Nāgārjuna's views is that a person level of description is just as real or unreal as the skandhas and all the Abhidharma categories. Perhaps then, it is not coincidental that Chandrakirti's point about the ineliminable character of an upadathara can be expressed, as I've expressed it, as a point about persons. Perhaps, indeed, Chandrakirti here unwittingly gives expression to something worth the name Puddhalavada. Now, the characteristic claim of Puddhalavada, of course, is that even though we are without selves, there is nevertheless an ineliminable person, or Puddhala, that ultimately exists in some way, albeit not in any of the ways that the tradition had taken to constitute ultimately existing. Of course, a Madhyamaka would never affirm the Puddhala as ultimately existent, since it is just the point of Madhyamaka that to say that there is nothing that is ultimately existent. But Puddhalavada can be characterized not so much as asserting the ultimate reality of something additional, but as more basically challenging standard Abhidharmika thoughts about what defines anything as ultimately real in the first place. And I take my bearings here from an excellent but unpublished essay by Amber Carpenter called Persons Keeping Their Karma Together, the Reasons for Puddhalavada in Early Buddhism. And Carpenter makes a cogent case for thinking of Puddhalavada as most concerned to challenge the dominant Abhidharmika conception of the Paramarthasat, the ultimately existent, as defined by being Dravyasat, existent as a substance. Like Nāgārjuna, the Puddhalavada position is most concerned to target a criterion of existence. What motivates the Puddhalavada position, Carpenter emphasizes, is a concern with the problem of how or whether Abhidharmikas can individuate the continua, santana, in which dharmas supposedly arise and disappear. The problem is whether Buddhist reductionists, for whom really existent wholes can never be found over and above the parts that constitute them, are entitled to help themselves to the idea that we can identify discrete continua of causally related events at all. Now, Buddhists need the idea of a continuum or a continua to explain such things as why, even without a self, I remember only my experiences and not yours. The answer to the way they solve that is to say, well, because the present moments of what I think of as my experience are causally continuous with things in what I think of as my past in ways that they're not causally continuous with yours. But the idea that we can identify discrete causal continua that way begs precisely the question at issue for them. This is because the kind of continuum Abhidharmikas have in mind can itself be picked out only relative to the personal level of explanation that they, of description that they aim to reduce. We can, for example, only say which continuum we have in mind by referring to the person that is said to really to consist therein. So how can we say, well, which causal continuum are these dharmas part of without saying, well, they're part of the continuum that makes up you, and we've just referred to a person then. Thus, Carpenter contends that Udgalavadins were above all, and I quote, alert to the fact that the ultra-minimalist Buddhist view inevitably presumes the individuation of person constituting aggregates and person constituting streams. This led them to argue that there has to be a unique and ineliminable relation that defines any group of aggregates or events as continuous in the way that's necessary for identifying and explaining persons. I quote again, the Udgalavada recognizes and avoids the circularity by acknowledging that in one central case, our convenience does not determine, but rather tracks the different ways in which aggregates are related. Their idea is that the characteristically Abhidharmika analysis of selves makes sense only insofar as impersonal dharmas are understood as always occurring in continua. But these continua can themselves be identified only with reference to persons. If that is the main thesis of Udgalavada, then I would not hesitate to say that Nāgārjuna, on my interpretation of him, is indeed rather a Udgalavadin. For the argument I have just sketched following Carpenter is clearly to the same effect as the kinds of arguments I have taken as most characteristic of Madhyamaka. For both Nāgārjuna on my reading and Udgalavada on Carpenter's, the principal concern is to show that characteristically Abhidharmika explanations of selves cannot coherently be thought to be exhaustive. And in both cases, the reason is the same. Because the impersonal dharmas proposed by Abhidharmikas as ultimately existent can themselves come into view only insofar as the conventionally existent world is already in view. Only insofar, most basically, as persons are already in view. Nevertheless, I have argued that Madhyamaka makes good sense as elaborating the cardinal Buddhist doctrine of Anatmavad. So what I want to say against my critics is, yes, this can be characterized as a somehow Udgalavadin interpretation, but it nevertheless can be understood just as well as an elaboration of the no-self doctrine. And make no mistake, I take it that when Nāgārjuna argues, as in Mula Madhyamaka Karaka 27.8, which I gave you a few minutes ago, when he argues that the lesson of Anatmavada is not that we are entitled to the conviction that there is no self, he is not compromising the doctrine of Anatmavada, he's arguing for it. his argument on my reading is that the theoretical positing of new kinds of things can never coherently be thought to tell us what we really are, for the finally simple reason that there is, indeed there can be, no such thing as what we really are. The point is not to answer that question. So it's possible then to be committed to the doctrine of selflessness and yet to refuse the idea that this doctrine demands that we explain what there really is instead of the selves that we thought there were. Indeed, it is reasonable to think that the doctrine of selflessness holds precisely that insistence on answering the question, what am I really, was all along precisely the problem to be overcome. In which case, for the Abhidharma tradition to answer that question is only for them to involve themselves in the very problem. Now, it's uncontroversial to say that Nāgārjuna wants to show that not only are selves dependent upon all manner of things, but also that the dharmas posited by Abhidharmikas are dependent on that they lack the kind of independence that would make them paramartasa. In other words, it's uncontroversial to say that Nāgārjuna argued not only for Pudgala Nairatmya, but also for Dharma Nairatmya. The point most characteristic of my interpretation of Madhyamaka is that among the things Abhidharmika categories depend on is the very phenomena they were invoked to explain, which means the Abhidharmika's dharmas make sense only relative to the personal level of explanation that both Atmavada and the Abhidharmika elaboration of Anatmavada were supposed to explain. But one can affirm this and still argue, as a proponent of selflessness, that there is no kind of thing, or with Abhidharmikas, no kinds of things, that being a person ultimately is. While Charles Goodman is right then in his critical review of my book, that on my reading Nāgārjuna resists, quote, the idea that thought and agency are made possible by and actually consist in a complex array of impersonal processes. While he's right about that, that's only because Nāgārjuna disagrees with Goodman in thinking that that idea represents, quote, one of the greatest intellectual achievements of the Buddhist tradition. In other words, it's only because Nāgārjuna disagrees, more precisely, with the Abhidharmika strand of Buddhist philosophy, according to which Goodman's complex array of impersonal processes has the kind of svabhava in virtue of which it makes sense to say that these alone ultimately exist. But that's not to refuse Anatmavada, it's to argue for an interpretation of it. Let me conclude by bringing to mind a classically Buddhist trope. Here's another gesture towards the Buddhist bona fides of my interpretation. A classically Buddhist trope that makes sense of the argument I've tried to make, namely the famous unanswered questions, or avyakrita vastuni, that figure early in the Buddhist tradition. At various points in the Pali Suttas and many other Buddhist scriptures, the Buddha famously declines to answer such questions as whether or not a Buddha exists after death and whether or not the self is identical with the body. How we are to understand the Buddha's silence is, of course, a matter of some debate. One interpretation is suggested in a different context by B.K. Matilal, who writes that, and I quote, "These unanswered questions were not regarded by the Buddha as really unanswerable. It would be a wrong interpretation if we believed that the Buddha left these questions entirely unanswered. The Buddha used, in fact, the vibhajya method to give answers to these questions." By the vibhajya method, Matilal means a method of analysis and differentiation, following which typically consists in, and I quote Matilal again, breaking up vibhajya, the whole, into its component parts, and by doing which seeking a satisfactory answer to the unanswered questions. Clearly, this interpretation describes precisely the project of Abhidharma, which characteristically seeks to answer the most basic questions about what is finally real. However, according to the Buddhist tradition's predominant interpretation, or what is arguably the predominant interpretation of the unanswered questions, the point is precisely not that the Buddha answers these questions on other occasions. Rather, the Buddha is understood to have declined to answer because the questions themselves make sense only given premises that it is precisely the point of the Buddha's teachings to refute. To ask, for example, whether or not the Buddha exists after death is to suppose that he existed before death. But insofar as the whole point of the tradition's cardinal doctrine is to deny that the Buddha ever existed, that he ever existed as a self or as something paramarthasaya, given that that's the whole point, the question's implicit premise must not be validated by the giving of an answer. I'm suggesting that the Madhyamaka way of understanding the most basic questions entailed by the selflessness doctrine exhibits the same logic. Madhyamakas argue on my reading that anatmavada, the Buddhist tradition's cardinal doctrine, is misunderstood if it is thought to require that we specify what really exists instead of selves. The point of the doctrine, rather, is to say that nothing at all exists in the way that we are habitually committed to thinking that ourselves exist. Precisely insofar as he is thus most basically arguing against a particular criterion of existence, namely the svabhava criterion, that is shared by Atmavadins and by Abhinarvadas, Nāgārjuna can reasonably think that our framing question, again, if there are no selves, then what is there really, makes sense only given a premise that it is precisely the point to reject. So the basic ontological question that launches the whole Abhidharma project, the question, what is ultimately existent, is a question that Nāgārjuna thinks can only lead to incoherent answers. This is, however, an eminently Buddhist position, a position that is not only not at odds with, but that counts indeed as elaborating the Buddhist tradition's cardinal doctrine. Asked, what does being a person ultimately consist in, Nāgārjuna joins the Buddha in refusing the question, which is a perfectly sensible way for a proponent of the no-self doctrine to respond. Thank you.
So we have some time for discussion now. Does anyone of you raise?
本当は通訳するとかって約束で人間は嘘ついちゃいけないんですけれど、すみません。まあポイントは最初に言ったようなことで、彼の最初の著作に対する批判がいくつかあったわけです。で、アーノルドは龍樹あるいはチガン派をプテガラバーディンと理解している、今日のお話でもそう取っていいんじゃないかということを彼は言ってましたですけど、プテガラバーディンは仏教ではヘレティクスであると、傷んでるだから無我の説からするとアーノルドさんの儒眼理解は仏教的じゃないんじゃないかというそういう批判を受けて、本日の講演になったわけであります。特にガネイリーですね、ガネイリーさんの著作だとか、あるいは私は今回初めてでもないんだけど フェッターさんですね、ティロマ・フェッター、大学者です。私たちの少し上の、10年ぐらい上のね、数年前に、2年ぐらい前に亡くなりましたけれど、オランダの非常に哲学者したインド学者、仏教学者だったんですけれど、彼は非常に早くから、中論の26章、27章は常に問題になってきたわけですね。26章、27章は果たして龍谷自身が書いたのかという説だとか、あるいはリートナーはあれは後から付け加えたなんかアペンディクスみたいなものだと。フェッターさん自身はひょっとしたら龍谷が若い時に書いた作品じゃないかというのが26章、27章に対する評価なんですが、そこでフェッターは特に27章第8行ですね、今日取り上げられたところで、アートマンが存在しないというような決定はないという一言がございます。それおよびそれ以外にたくさんのフェッターはリストを作ってますけれど、何十下というところにたくさんの下にプルガラという表現であったり、あるいは男性単数のみなというような形で、いわば講義の主体を表すような表現がたくさん出てくると。それはもうプルガラバーダ的な、ところから龍谷が育ってきたんじゃないかと、今日もさっきのプレゼンテーションがありましたけれど、そういう意見をフェッターは持っていたのでようであります。私はフェッター大変尊敬しますから、どうかそうかなというところもあるんですけれど、後でちょっと、その辺も議論してみたいと思います。それじゃあ少し、when I was a student, back 40 or 50 years ago, one of my great teachers was Yutaka Ojihara, very famous or well-established, well-known, widely known scholar of Vyakarana. And whenever he invited foreign visitors to give a lecture at Kyodai, he was the first person to raise the questions and gave very severe questions to the visitor. And I once asked him, why you invited somebody like, I remember John Bruff, for example. And Bruff gave a series of lectures on Dhammapada. And his British accent was really difficult to follow for us. But anyway, Ojihara always asked many difficult questions. So I asked him, why after inviting such an important person, why you give such a difficult question? Then his answer was, to give a hard question is the best treatment. So now, today, I'm trying to do my own part, following Ojihara Sensei's lead. So now, well, you talked about two levels of reality, ultimate reality, conventionally real, and ultimate real. So I say, according to Dr. Arnold, for Madhyamaka, if I'm wrong, please correct me. According to Dr. Arnold, for Madhyamaka, everything, including past, Bhutgara, and even self-Atman, is conventionally real, and there's nothing ultimately real. Is it okay? You have something?
No.
Okay. Then, from now, I'm trying to do something similar. For Abhidharmikas, everything that is verbally communicated in our everyday conversation, or whatever you say, anything like board or desk, etc., including person, Pudgala, is conventionally real, and it can be analyzed into or reduced to dharmas that are ultimately real. So in other words, Abhidharmikas accept two levels of reality: conventional real, those are the things which are named by everyday language. And that is what is ultimately real, actually dharmas. So dharmas are sort of technical terms supposed to be used by, uttered by the Buddha. So this is something similar to this scientific description of the world and our everyday language. then for Yogacaras, you didn't discuss Yogacara. For Yogacaras, everything that is verbally communicated in our everyday conversation, I just followed, copied the previous page, including person, as well as dharmas of Abhidharmakas, except for Chitta, Manas, Vijnana, are conventionally real. And only Chitta, Manas, Vijnana is ultimately real. So, for Yogacaras, everything is conventionally real, but only Chitta, Manas, Vijnana, something mental, is ultimately real. And for example, Vasubandhu, if he is the author of the Bhasha of Madhyamaka Buddhist, he quotes Chutta Sunyata Sutta, and there's this famous word of Parishista, what remains after the Shunyata negation is real. So there's something real in Yogacara. Or we can also refer to Bodhisattva Bhumi, Tattva Artha Chatta, and Yogacara insists that there must be some foundation, or you may call it Upadana, some foundation, which is the basis for prajnapti, vyavahara, etc. So there's something real for Yogacara. Then for Puddhakarapadi, there are 5, so this is a traditional description of Puddhakarapadi. There are 5 categories, 5 kind of dharmas, namely the past, present, and future Sanskrita dharmas, and asanskrita dharma, and what they call the anirubhajaniya, inexpressible, ineffable. That is actually Puddhakara, and Puddhakara is neither identical with nor different from 5 skandhas. And initially, they seem to take Puddhakara, Puddhakarapadi seem to have taken Puddhakara as ultimately real, because we have evidences from Katapattu or Vijnanakaya, and Puddhakarapadins that in those materials, Puddhakarapadins were reported to believe in the ultimate reality of Puddhakara. I'm sorry, I'm a historian of Buddhism, so I know you are a philosopher of Buddhism, and we have a different approaches. But this is the only way I can discuss Buddhist philosophy, so please allow me to speak in this way.
I allow you.
So perhaps under the criticism, especially from Theravada, Sarvasivadi, and maybe even Nāgārjuna, I don't know, Puddhakarapadins seem to come to regard Puddhakara as Upadaya Prajnapti. So I suspect his expression Upadaya Prajnapti, this was commonly used by Theravada and Adharma too, or also Sarvasivadi Adharma. But Puddhakarapadins also use this expression Upadaya Prajnapti to describe Puddhakara, and especially that example, a simile of Agni Indana, fire and fuel, was probably first introduced by Puddhakarapadi. Well, this is only my conjecture. So that one is about two levels of reality. And now, well, most important point, or what puzzled me in your paper is what do you mean by Anattamapada? And this is not a very simple question. And well, in order to understand what exactly is Anattamapada, we should specify what is Atman. Unless we know Pratishedia, we do not know Pratishedia. So I think there are 3 possible candidates for Atman. The first candidate is self, the object of Ahankara. And in your quotation of Chandra Kirti, it's a commentary on Arya Deva's Jatushataka. Atman was characterized as Vishaya, object of Ahankara, not Ahankara, but Atmagraha or Atmasreya. But this kind of self is, of course, denied by even by Hindus and Brahmins. I remember, I don't know how much time I have. In 2005, we had a small workshop on Apoha in the middle of Swiss Alps near Lausanne. And Arindam Chakrabarti, maybe you know the name. He came, and one morning, Arindam and I woke up very early, 4 or 5 in the morning, because we all came from the different continents. So both of us, Arindam and I went out to the Alps, and he invited me to see the sunrise. And then I clearly remember he said, "You Buddhists think you deny the self or Atman, but if it means the object, just the object of egoticism, of course, he is a devoted Hindu. Of course, we Hindus also deny selfishness or object of egotism. So, first, if Anattamapada means just a denial of self, or selfishness, there's nothing special about Buddhism. Then, self was, so second choice for Atman, maybe self or soul as the agent of growth from the baby to the old man, and eventually this agent of transmigration from one life to another. And as you know well, Pudgala or Pudgala described in Abhidhamma chapter 9, he plays this role. And the third possibility may be some kind of ineffable item, indescribable item, or something beyond our description, which they called Atman, and that is supposed to be realized by in deep meditation. Well, one of my friend, very good friend, Akamatsu, Akihiko Akamatsu, he is now vice president of Kyoto University, so he didn't come today. But once he wrote that, maybe having been criticized by the Buddhists, not necessarily the Buddha himself, but having been criticized by Buddhist doctrine of Anattamapada, philosophers of Upanishad started to deepen their meditation from just a object, so Atman just as being the object of self-awareness. But they gradually deepened their meditation and try to reach higher level or higher awareness of Atman. And perhaps we see that process of deeper and deeper meditation in most well-known case is Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, 3 or 4 levels of Atman. So, especially Atman in the deep sleep. So, when you discuss Anattamapada, I would like you to be aware that what kind of Atman Buddhists are criticizing. Then I would say a little bit about the Buddha's position. As a principle, the Buddha did not quarrel, well, it is recorded that the Buddha did not quarrel with people. He often says he doesn't quarrel with loka people. So he seems to have employed the word like Atman, in the sense of one's own or oneself, in his discourse. But when he was questioned whether Atman exists or not, he is reported to have kept silence. So this is Abhyakrita, you mentioned in your paper. So she, for example, Katyayana Bhavada Sutta, which is actually mentioned by Nāgārjuna in the Karika, chapter 15, and quoted by Vasubandhu in Abhidharma chapter 9. There, there in that Katyana Papada, Buddha just refused to answer, or he did not answer the question given by Vatsa or somebody. And later, Ananda asked Buddha why he did not answer those questions. And he gave, if Buddha answered there is an Atman, then Vatsa or somebody would go into the Shashvata Pada. And if he answered there's no Atman, then Vatsa would become Uchedavadi. So so I think this is the position of the Buddha. So Buddha never answered there's a self, or there's an Atman, or there's no Atman. So he just kept Abhyakrita position. Then Buddha's usage of anatta, or Atman, is traditionally understood to have two meanings very well known. Non-self, so this is a Tattva compound, and no-self, roughly compound. And famous passage is from Yashomitra. Yashomitra clearly gives these two interpretations. And in Nikayas, the Buddha is reported to deny the identity between each member of five skandhas, or Rupa, Vedana, etc., with Atman. So, for example, he says Rupa is not Atman, etc. Rupa is not Atman, Vedana is not Atman, Sanskara is not Atman. But what he meant by Atman is not clear at all. Again, we do not know. Then he uses the term Pukka, meaning person. So, for example, he has a short discourse on 4 kinds of Pukkaras, for example. Good person, but I don't remember exactly, but anyway. He certainly uses Pukka. And this term Pukka is not really a classical Sanskrit word, but the term shared by Jains in a different sense, that is a kind of material atom. So this term Pukara or Putgara comes from different tradition, different philosophical religious tradition, different from Brahmanical tradition. And it is probably in Milinda Panha that the Buddhists first tried to prove the unreality of Atman as the agent of transmigration and gave the theory of samsara without Atman. And this is the beginning of the reductionist approach. But in the Mahayana sutras, such as Mahaparinirvana Sutra, the Buddhists started arguing that the Buddha preaches anattama doctrine in order to deny the wrong views or wrong ideas of Atman developed by the Brahmanical circle. The Buddha, according to Mahaparinirvana Sutra, the Buddha wanted to teach true Atman. That they called Buddha Dhatu or Tathagata. Therefore, it is not correct to characterize Buddhist philosophy simply as anattama-pada. So this is my comment on your paper. Because there are Buddhists who advocate true Atman, and there are different versions of anattama-pada. Even Yogacara Buddhists was regarded as a kind of atma-badi. For example, Bhaviveka criticized Arya Vijnana precisely as Atman. So these are the main points of my criticism. And now a little bit about some small things about Pratityasampada and Upadaya. Well, regarding these two words, as I recommended you, Salvini, Martin Salvini in Thailand wrote a very interesting article. Actually, you too seem to share the similar understanding. But he still keeps the translation designation for Prajnapti. But otherwise, as a compound, actually, Upadaya Prajnapti, as Salvini insisted, we should take it as a compound. like Pratitya Sampada. So, but then I'm listing there two rather opposing understanding of Pratitya Sampada. And I suspect your understanding of Pratitya Sampada probably comes from Chandrakirti. And Chandrakirti, especially in the first chapter of Prasannapada, he records the debate with Bhaviveka, how to understand Pratitya Sampada, especially the compound Pratitya Sampada. And his conclusion there is Pratitya Sampada is parasparapeksha, mutual dependence or mutual expectation, whatever. So I somehow sense that your understanding of Pratitya Sampada, well, because you are heavily relying on Chandrakirti, so your understanding of Pratitya Sampada seems to be parasparapeksha. But from chapter 1 of Prasannapada, and from Bhaviveka's own work, it is quite clear that Pratitya Sampada for Bhaviveka and probably for many others, Pratitya Sampada means what is explained in terms of idam pratyeta, which is simply causality. Well, here there is a fixed formula to express idam pratyeta. So, asmin sati, idam pratik, and so on. There are four formulas to express idam pratyeta. And that is simply a formula to establish causal relationship between two items, two dharmas. So, well, maybe this is a little bit off point from your paper, but when you discuss Pratitya Sampada, I want you to take it in consideration that the Buddhist Pratitya Sampada theory was probably originally the theory of causality or causation. So not necessarily parasparapeksha. One Japanese scholar called Yamaguchi Zuiho sensei, criticized Chandrakirti heavily because parasparapeksha is not a true interpretation, or correct interpretation of Pratitya Sampada. And regarding Upadaya Prajakti, well, I'm still not so happy with the translation of relative manifestation. So I still like to keep some kind of sense of concept or conceptualization or designation for Prajakti. But of course, you are free to choose your translation. So conclusion. It is safe to assume that Madhyamaka has accepted the conventional reality of Buddhagara or person as many other Buddhists would do, which does not contradict their denial of the ultimate reality of Anattamapada by any means. Therefore, I do not see why you had to defend what you call radical interpretation of Madhyamaka. And one additional however, I do not agree with Fetter, who wants to see Buddhagara trace in Nāgārjuna's usage of the masculine agents such as Gantri, Rakta, etc., and even Buddhagara. Yeah, as you said, there are 6 occurrences of Buddhagara in the Karika. So this is my understanding. When Nāgārjuna talks about the pair of Upadatri and Upadana, we should be reminded that he had Sanskrit grammarian's Karaka theory in his mind. So, as I understand, Nāgārjuna wanted to demonstrate the accomplishment of any act clear cannot and should not be described by Karaka theory, that is mere prapancha. So, and that's an unkind remark. So this is my first final remark. Dr. Arnold tries to interpret Indian Buddhist philosophers through his understanding of Western philosophers. So we had a little bit about Martin Heidegger. I'm not quite happy with this kind of approach. I would like to locate the philosophical problems such as self in both Indian and Western contexts and compare how different traditions of philosophy solved problems differently or similarly. It is true that it is not easy to understand what one did not know previously, but one should not try to understand some alien idea only in one's own framework of thoughts. That's it. Thank you very much for your patience.
So, Dr. Arnold, can you respond to Professor Katsura's comments?
Okay, so let me just I'll respond briefly just to 3 of those points. And it goes without saying that you would have a rejoinder to these. It's in the nature of these conversations that a definitive conclusion never seems to be reached. First of all, regarding what you said was your most important point, the question about what Anatmavada means and the question whether that is indeed the cardinal doctrine of the tradition. I take it as a fairly uncontroversial claim to say that that is the cardinal doctrine of the tradition, and that that's the doctrine in terms of which other Indian schools of thought identified and characterized the Buddhist tradition. And that a lot of characteristically Buddhist arguments, the Apoha doctrine, critiques of theism, for example, being especially clear, amount to kinds of arguments that are similar to the arguments against self, that they're always going to be arguing against the reality of wholes over and above their parts. But you're, of course, quite right that what that means and what the doctrine comes to is endlessly debatable, very much a question. And you're also right, and you brought this up with respect to what, in fact, various Hindu schools of thought believe. It's a fair question whether what the Buddhists are targeting when they critique the Atman is a straw man. You know, maybe the Tibetans say that the kind of self that's being targeted is Tak Chik Rangwang Chen Kitak, a permanent, unitary, autonomous self. And it's a fair question whether anyone holds that kind of view. I was at an NEH conference on Buddhism and consciousness, comparing Buddhist and contemporary perspectives on this. And some of the philosophers at the conference got to wondering by the end whether the Buddhists were targeting a conception of self that nobody really holds, and that's not very interesting. And that's a fair question. But in any case, I take it it's sort of the tradition-defining doctrine, even though, of course, it's an endlessly interpretable doctrine. But I was doing 2 things here. I was basically trying to say what I think Nāgārjuna understands the doctrine to be. So I wasn't meaning to say anything about what the doctrine essentially means for Buddhists in general. Rather, I was trying to say what Nāgārjuna thinks it means. But even more basically, and this is the easiest answer I have to your questions in this regard, I was trying to respond to critics who were saying, you can't make sense on your interpretation of Madhyamaka as a Buddhist position where they mean by that Anatmavada. And my answer is, yes, I can. So I take from my critics the challenge to make this consistent, make my interpretation consistent with this. You made the point as well, and here's the second thing I'll respond to. You made the point as well that Pudgala is a term used without shame by many Buddhists. That Vasubandhu, for example, uses the term Pudgala. That also is quite right. And here maybe my best answer is to concede that perhaps everything I say about Abhidharma and characterizing the Abhidharma tradition is tendentious. In other words, you can ask whether my characterization of Abhidharma is adequate to the things that Abhidharma philosophers themselves said. I'm inclined to read Abhidharma as I think Nāgārjuna understood them, but it's a reasonable question whether he gets them right or whether instead there's a perfectly reasonable rejoinder from the Abhidharma. Because I think there probably is. I have come over the years to think of Vasubandhu as one of the greatest and most subtle thinkers of the tradition. And so I think it's a perfectly fair question whether Vasubandhu is really hit by this critique. But I take it that Abhidharma as Nāgārjuna understands it, or at least as I understand Nāgārjuna to understand it, is the view that the explanation of persons in terms of dharmas is taken to be exhaustive. That what it means to propose the dharma analysis as paramartha sat is to say that this is exhaustive, that having given an analysis of persons into momentary dharmas, we can capture everything there is to be known about them, and we don't need to make any reference to persons anymore. In the same way, as you rightly said, that scientific theories of the mental on some contemporary views have it that our common sense view of the mental will one day be shown to be an optional theory, a kind of folk psychology that we can dispense with, but then in fact everything there is to understand about it can be captured in terms of the scientific description. I take it that's how Nāgārjuna understands Abhidharma. And again, it's a fair question whether in fact Abhidharmakas meant that. So there's a fair question whether they were proposing the Paramartha Sat as meant to be exhaustive and meant to explain away the conventional truth. J. Garfield is fond of saying in this regard that really all the Buddhist schools of thought affirm two truths, not one truth and one falsehood. And on my reading, Nāgārjuna takes Abhidharma to instead to affirm like one truth and one falsehood. So again, there's a fair question whether he gets Abhidharma right. The last thing on my sort of philosophical and comparative approach, perhaps especially vis-a-vis the historical philological approach. What I typically say in this regard is that some kind of philosophically constructive engagement, some imaginative attempt to think along with these thinkers and to imagine perhaps their answer to questions that they didn't entertain, is a necessary part of the hermeneutic circle. So understanding what these texts mean isn't just a matter of seeing what the sentences say. It's understanding the sense that the claims make, and that you can, my thought is that you can only understand the sense that the claims make if you can imagine some account of, well, how might they respond to objections to it, perhaps even objections that they didn't consider, so that entering creatively into thinking with them is a necessary part. I certainly would not want for that moment in the hermeneutic circle to come at the expense of hearing back from the text what they say. So you said something about worried about using only one's own framework to understand what the text means. And I certainly wouldn't want to do that. I understand my interpretation as answerable to Nāgārjuna's text. And whether or not I can interpret things he says, and whether I can make sense of his claims on my interpretation is important for me. If I couldn't, that would be a problem. So that's what it's saying.
Thank you. Just a brief. Anyway, thank you very much for your answers. And regarding the second point, actually, the list of dharmas given in, for example, Abhidharma portion, there are 75 dharmas. That is not really an exhaustive list. I think, at least according to Yashomitara. So maybe you better not take it as an exhaustive list. And regarding the third point, yes, we philologists and historians also think on our way. So we also try to sense what Nāgārjuna really wanted to say, and we try to reconstruct his system of thought or philosophy in our own way, but probably not in the model of Western philosophy. But then there is, well, in the East, or in the East Asian Buddhist tradition, there is some tradition of interpreting Buddhist philosophy for a long time. So probably often we Japanese scholars often rely on that kind of tradition. But now that we have not only Chinese materials, but we also have Tibetan, Sanskrit, Pali material, we try to do our best to think it over. Okay, that's all. Thank you very much.